Hey guys, what is up? Public here, back with another video, and today we're talking about the liberation of Undermine as a Shadow Priest in Season 2. So this video is coming out the week that the raid launches. Now there's quite a lot of this that is going to be a little outdated. I'm going to see some kind of PTR footage in the background when I was doing normal, heroic, and mythic testing on some of these bosses. But my thinking here is I want you guys to have the same information that I do going into the raid launching. So some of this might be outdated, or you might see some like gameplay in the background. I pretty much only played Archon during PTR testing, but we'll talk quite a lot about hero talent options and like when each one makes sense. But really this should be kind of your survival guide for jumping into the raid week 1 and hopefully doing as well as you can, assuming this is your first time going into it, that kind of thing. So we'll cover a little bit of like tips and tricks of what I picked up on the PTR, and then we'll do a little bit of what talent builds to try when each one makes sense, and go through a little bit of that kind of theory crafting from a build perspective. So not really going to talk about too much else as far as like power or things like that, or like how to get rank 1 or things like that. Like that will come later down the road, depending on how stable things get with builds. I'll likely do like a follow-up video to this in like a couple weeks, just to kind of refresh and do like a full-fledged guide. But for now, let's cover all the things you need to know to walk into these bosses week 1. Alright, so from a talent perspective and kind of how we're going to break up this video with talents, I'm going to go boss by boss as much as we know for that. I'm mostly going to cover the kind of how you handle the fight as a Shadow Priest and less of this is how the boss works. So if you don't quite know how the bosses work, so the kind of general idea of the fights, probably best to go look at like a generic raid guide first, and then you can kind of watch this to know like, okay, here's how to apply some Shadow Priest specific stuff to that particular encounter. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the first boss. I say first boss, when we go through this, I'm kind of just going to go over in the order the Dungeon Journal presents them. There is a little bit of options here of what you do when, but the first boss, regardless, is Vexie Fullthrottle. So this boss, kind of right off the bat, it is a single target plus ad fight here, and the ads are quite important. Now, this fight is actually kind of interesting because you have an intermission phase for this first boss that gives you double damage. So kind of the reasoning for builds here is going to be kind of alongside that. So what ends up happening here is bikers are going to be flying all over the room. As a Shadow Priest, what you're going to want to do is position yourself near the boss. The bikers kind of like loosely target players. So what happens if you're standing right next to the boss, the bikers will fly into you and hopefully land pretty close to where the boss is being tanked alongside the wall here. And at that point, you can dot them. You don't want to like leave, like they're going to kind of spawn far out. If you walk away from the boss to then dot them, you could bait them into a bad spot. You don't want to do that. It's okay to wait on dotting them, they got to be in range anyway for Psychic Link. So then once they actually full forward, okay, then you try to like Shadow Crash 1 or 2 of them, and then Vampiric Touch the one that you're missing, things like that. Try to get the whatever, biggest clump that you can. And then at this point, you kind of have 2 options depending on how fast your group is going to kill ads. You can choose to like focus down an ad that's really far away from the boss, or you can just cleave off the boss with Psychic Link hitting all the other ads as well. This will be kind of group dependent on what you're going to do. Both strategies are definitely fine here. And for the most part, the timing is going to work out. You want to use all of your cooldowns right on pull and then just on cooldown from there. The reason that we want to do that is the intermission phase that I mentioned earlier. So the intermission phase, mechanical breakdown, the boss will take double damage during this period of time, and you can kind of control when this happens. So every time that you kill a bike, a player from your raid can jump on it and then ram it into the boss. You have to do this a couple times depending on the difficulty to get the boss to trigger its intermission. Now what you can do here is you can kind of game this a little bit because you have a little bit of time here, and you can wait to send that last bike into the boss to make sure everyone has their 2-minute cooldowns up. If you like full send, we did a couple times on the PTR, if you go really quick, it'll be like 145 or 150, give or take, or maybe even a little bit sooner. So what we ought to do in my group is we held for like 10 or 15 seconds to make sure that going into the burn, everyone had everything for the start. You could even potentially choose to lust out with your group. It's kind of up to you. And then you're going to go into this double damage phase. Now, in testing, this double damage phase was lasting about 45 seconds is how long the debuff was actually active for. That's a pretty long time. Now, this is really, kind of depending on like where you can map out your stuff. Archon versus Voidweaver here, I think both are actually going to do pretty well here. Archon's going to have better sustained burst over that kind of 45-second period. Voidweaver is going to be really good for like the first, 15 or 20 seconds. But then when Rift falls off, Dark Ascension falls off, right? You'll get your second Rift 30 seconds in, but that one won't be buffed by Dark Ascension, so it's going to be a little off for Voidweaver. You definitely can still make it work. Voidweaver, if you didn't know, is like 5-ish% ahead of Archon in like pure single target damage. But I think with the way this boss works, and because it's like a longer ramp time, I would suggest starting out as Archon, at least for progression. I think it's going to give you that better burst in that intermission phase. And it's a little bit easier to execute because you can kind of tell, hey, I think the boss is about to phase soon, and you can halo as it's like that last bike is sending into it. Voidweaver has a bit more of like, hey, I'm just doing my damage now kind of a thing. So it's kind of up to you. Archon is also a little bit easier when we're kind of target swapping if you do need to hit those adds in the first phase. So I would start off with Archon, but I still think Voidweaver is going to be really solid here. Now, during the intermission, there will be adds that come in and heal the boss. For the most part, we're just there to, big damage on the boss, but there is a little bit of pad there. Because the boss is taking double damage, your Psychic Link is hitting all of those adds extra hard as well. So you loosely want to be, dotting these adds when it makes sense for you. Obviously, if you're in the middle of your cooldowns, spending time vampiric touching like 8 adds, not a good idea. This is why we take Shadow Crash for this fight, that we can still throw that out, make sure the adds are dying at a respectable time, and they're going to proc Twist of Fate for you, especially in that kind of first burn phase. But otherwise, we're not really hard focusing them down in that intermission. Same goes for Mythic. That ad just gets CC'd anyways. So that's what we're going to do for this fight, is kind of plan on doing that. I think for me, like I said, I'm going to walk into this fight as Archon with the single target Shadow Crash build. If it turns out that the damage feels really lackluster, I might try Voidweaver, but I'm assuming we're just going to one-shot this and most stuff. So I'm going to try it Archon just because I think that intermission phase is going to be a little bit better. Okay? So that is Vexie as a Shadow Priest. That's all the kind of things we have to go on that. Let's move on to the next boss. All right, next up we have the Cauldron of Carnage. This is a 2-boss encounter that's kind of just single target. We had a similar boss fight in Aberrus. The one big change here is we really can't stand in the middle on this boss. You'll definitely see some people that parse well and do this, but being able to hit both bosses at once means you're in range of both of their mechanics at once. And the problem on this fight is why that's an issue. Because of the dinosaur specifically, he's going to target a bomb on a player. That thing cannot be in the middle of the room, which is where you would be standing if you're hitting both adds. You can kind of bait in and out when you know the bomb is coming, but then you really, like, soaking the bomb becomes a problem, and then you're just kind of moving all over the place. The other big problem with this is the bosses do have to remain far enough away from each other. Unfortunately, if you decide to play Archon on this fight, Halo's range isn't getting that extra, full extension from Phantom Reach. So it's not a 47-yard range. It's only like 45 or 44 to get that like double hit. On testing, I found that since the bosses were usually tanked a little further apart than they needed to, just to conserve space in the room, particularly on like the dino side, that my Halo was often missing one of the bosses, or even both of them if I was like really kind of trying to hit both at once. So I would say for progression, unless something has changed, it doesn't make sense to stand in the middle. There's also like a stacking dot that you're taking. In some testing, it wasn't doing anything. In some testing, it was doing way too much damage. So who knows where they'll land with like live tuning. But for now, you basically want to play this fight as single target. And then what will happen is eventually they'll go into an intermission and they clash with each other. Now, during this point, you can hit both bosses at the same time. It's a relatively short window though. So like you don't have a whole lot of time to like ramp up your void form necessarily. It's also kind of awkward because you don't want to send your Halo there until both are stacked up, but then it takes too long to stack the debuff, and then they go back to their sides anyways. The other awkward part with that kind of intermission is there's a lot of mechanics going out, and usually that's when groups decide to swap sides. So you'll usually start on like the gorilla side and then move over to the dinosaur or whatever else it is. So that means you do have to do quite a bit of movement during that phase. So for this fight, I would personally suggest starting with Voidweaver. Voidweaver is 5% ahead, give or take, on like pure single target. And I think for the most part, we're going to play that fight like this. There aren't any adds that we're hitting. There were adds on PTR, I should say, but they were immune to damage, even though they were like weirdly targetable. So assuming that stays, we're not actually killing those adds. We're just kind of CCing them down. This is just a single target fight. Now, you will know that Voidweaver will be usually have better lineups with the intermission because you can get that nice little void torrent to time up and then move yourself to the other side. Obviously, the Rift itself will only be hitting one boss at a time, but that's okay. We're mostly just worried about that Psychic Link damage from Void Blast hitting the other boss as well. So you do want to make sure that both bosses are dotted when they go into the middle. Otherwise, you're just playing a single target boss for the most part, so not really a whole lot to think about here. I will note from like a defensive perspective, like I said, during that Colossal Clash intermission, that's usually when the most damage is happening, so you want to make sure you're using at least Fade. Weave a Flash Shield if you need to. Death Repair, that's what it's there for. Usually you want to hold Dispersion for like, oh crap, I need to soak a bomb on the Dino side, and maybe there's not enough people in it, or that kind of thing. So I would hold that, but otherwise, that's usually the idea here. Now, what this looks like from a cooldown timing, again, the timers are a little bit awkward. I think roughly when looking at logs, it's about 1 minute and 10 seconds in between the Colossal Clashes. So if you use all of your cooldowns on pull, you should have 1 minute back for the intermission phase, which as a Void Weaver means you're going to have to hold like 5 or so seconds to make sure that you get that lineup, but it should be okay to kind of use that as they're going over. Just be careful not to use it too early, because then the Rift will like slowly follow the boss as it goes into the middle. Of course, if you end up playing Archon, the 1 minute's line up a little bit naturally, but keep in mind that you're pretty much only going to debuff one of the bosses with Halo, which is fine. Just kind of slam that when you can, because you're going to want to use it. Because for the, somewhere in that like 210, 220, you'll just send everything again here. And then the second intermission will happen around like 240, give or take. So all the timers are in the Icy Veins guide if you kind of want to see examples for where and how to use cooldowns as Archon versus Void Weaver. But for the most part, at the current timing and the way that our spec is tuned, I would start off playing Void Weaver here for this fight. The other thing to mention is the ads on the Gorilla side. These guys are meant to be CC'd down. On Mythic, they actually don't want you to CC it, and you have to like kite it out of the arena, and then it will drop its like lightning thing. On Heroic and below difficult, you can kind of CC them around. From a priest perspective, Psychic Scream is going to be the easiest thing we have to handle these guys. The Dominate Mind was kind of working on PTR, and then eventually they broke it, so I don't know if that's going to stay, but I was able to use Dominate Mind in like the early normal heroic testing, so you can try that out as well if you'd like. The other one is Void Tendrils. Void Tendrils will also root the ad, although be very careful because you have to get quite close to get that to work. And then, like I said, on Mythic, you can't really CC because I think the goal is you want to kite them to the outside, and so that the pools cover the outside, not sitting in the middle of the room. Okay, so that is Cauldron of Carnage. Try out Void Weaver, see how it goes. If you absolutely hate it, Archon's okay too. It's just going to be about 4 or 5% behind in single target. All right, next boss we're going to cover is Rik Reverb. This is mostly a single target fight that has firework ads that spawn, and then he also goes into an intermission, but during that intermission, he is immune to damage or takes 99% reduced damage. So when we were testing this, it was tuned kind of aggressively, and the fireworks were definitely like the biggest thing that we struggled to kill in time. Not only do you have to focus down the ads, they have to die within enough time, or the group just wipes, basically. It puts a nasty dot on you. So for this, there was also like weird spawns that we had during PTR testing where they would just kind of be all over the place. I would love to run Void Weaver here on this boss just to get the extra single target damage on the boss, because that is just mostly a single target fight. The ads just have to die really, really quick. Archon, can do better with spread target, but the problem is, depending on how fast those ads are dying, they're not necessarily great for Archon either, because Archon takes like about 10 seconds for that Halo debuff to build up before you really get to crank on them. And typically with this fight, it'll be kind of dependent on how fast those fireworks actually end up dying, because if they're dying really fast, then, that's okay. You can probably just cleave right off the boss. And if that's the case, Void Weaver should still be really good, because you basically just have to dot all of the fireworks and then let the Void Blast Psychic Link the crap out of the ads. Big damage there. If it's the case, though, especially on progression, where the fireworks do need you to actually focus them down, especially if they've like spawned far away from the boss, it might be better to try out Archon there specifically, because as you guys have known, like with Void Weaver, if you have to like target swap with the Rift is just kind of slowly moving around the room, and that's not good for anyone. So kind of depends on how fast you're able to kill the ads, of which talent I would suggest with. I would say walk into this fight, be ready to play both, but likely I would start out here as Archon just to make sure that you can heavily focus an ad that spawns way off in the middle of nowhere. If they end up fixing kind of the firework positioning and how they've spawned, or maybe they're just like getting melted with your group, that's when I would just use Void Weaver, and then you can just dot the ads and then focus the boss and then just psychic link them down. So depending on how that works out with the tuning of when you've gone to the boss, you're going to want to play either. I think eventually as we get into this on like future kills, Void Weaver is going to end up being the default here. But for now, I think starting off as Archon is probably the right idea from like a progression mindset. Okay, so the other mechanic here to talk about is the actual pillars here. So usually they're going to assign ranged DPS or like a series of people to click these pillars. The one thing that I'll note here is you can use quite a lot of our defensives as you're clicking, or right before you click, I should say, because it does hit quite hard, especially on higher up difficulties. You can get targeted with random mechanics while you're clicking this, so you want to kind of make sure you have like a good defensive plan based on when you're clicking. There is a bit of grace period of when you actually need to click on your sound pillar. You'll kind of get the rhythm down. You can see I wasn't doing the best damage when I had to click, but someone has to do it. What I will say though is on higher difficulties, it's going to be a good idea to pre-pop dispersion and then click. You can click the pillar while you're in dispersion. That way, if you get like a faulty zap cast or something, you're not just getting absolutely wrecked. There is like a stacking dot that's happening, and dispersion helps counter that as well. So my general rule of thumb is right before you click this, I think dispersion is a great idea. And usually you're going to have that for every single time the group is going to ask you to click. If you do need to click again, and dispersion happens to be on cooldown, I just wouldn't go as high up on your stacks. Just make sure you keep an eye on that, or you're gonna have to ask for an external or something else like that. Okay. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. It's kill fireworks, click pillars, kill boss. That's really all that's happening here. During the intermission, the boss is, like I said, immune to damage. At this point, you should just be farming it for insanity, right? So using power word shield or other things just to build up your insanity. That way, when he comes back down, you should have a full bar of insanity, stack up your mind melt stacks, like that kind of stuff, just to get ready for the boss to be active again. And then you'll use your cooldowns again as soon as he comes back down. Be very mindful of timings on this boss. It was a little sus when we were testing where if you slammed your 2 minutes exactly on cooldown, the boss would go up like 10 seconds later. So depending on where those timers end up on live tuning, just make sure you're paying attention. You're not slamming your 2 minute cooldowns only for the boss to fly up 10 seconds later. Usually it was working out that you were using one set of cooldowns per phase, but we'll see if they've adjusted timings a little bit once it goes live. Okay, so that is Rik Reverb. That's all we have for this fight. All right, next up we have the trash boss, Stix Bunkjunker. So this guy is going to be pretty straightforward as a Shadow Priest. There's no kind of like specific advice here for the most part. It's really just kill the boss and perform the mechanics as usual. Parsing this fight is going to be kind of a crapshoot because of the way that the ads work. Almost everyone's going to get targeted with this trash ball that you're going to pick up trash, and you're not doing any actual damage here. I'm assuming the logs are going to filter all this out as well. So sort of like from like an optimizing damage perspective, you're just kind of doing whatever you can to make sure the raid can kill the ads fast enough, because the damage meters are just going to be a total RNG fest week to week. So what you want to focus on when you're not actually in that trash pile as a Shadow Priest is killing ads, particularly on heroic difficulty and up. There's an extra ad that spawns at Heroic and Mythic, the Territorial Bombshell. This guy's really important to kill very quickly because you need to drop him to 75% health to get him off the trash pile so that someone can roll over it. And then you have to then kill him. I think it's, you have like 30 seconds or so where he has to actually die after he spawns. Otherwise, he puts a giant dot on the entire raid. So as a ranged DPS, it's kind of your job here, especially as a Shadow Priest. Keep the boss dotted, Shadow Crash as many of the small ads as you can, but you really want to focus these Territorial Bombshell ads first, get them dotted, focus them down, kill them as quickly as you can, before then swapping back to either priority target ads or the boss itself. So there's going to be quite a lot of target switching in this fight because of that. And honestly, I don't think Void Reaver is going to do very well in this fight because of that reason. Ads are happening enough where if you're happening to move your Devouring Plague around, it's really difficult when you're playing Destroyed Reality. And the ads are important enough to where you do want to focus them down. So I would default to Archon on this boss. I think you could make Void Reaver work, especially if ads are stacked or they're maybe they're more clumped than they were on testing. But I think Archon will have an easier time just haloing the crap out of everything. You're going to debuff everything and be a little easier when you're swapping from the bombshells to whatever ads that you're trying to kill. The other reason why we're going to do a lot of target swapping is to take advantage of the way that Psychic Link works. So similar to the kind of damage amp on the first boss, the ads on this fight get a damage taken increase after they've been eaten by trash. So what happens is when the guys that have the trash ball eat the ads, they will spit them back out when the trash ball ends. And when they get spit back out, they get this debuff that makes them take extra damage. That's really important for us because we can cleave off of those ads. They're not going to live super long because of it, and get that increased Psychic Link damage on all of the other targets that we have our dots on. So it's going to be really important that you're tracking that debuff itself so that you know like, hey, this guy is debuffed. It's like a green little guy. You can see it on the frames that we have as well. Plater tracks it by default. The buff itself is called Messed Up. And they'll take double damage while they have that. And that's really the fight. You're just going to be kind of swapping in between different ads and then going back to the boss when they're all dead. And then he repeats the phase over and over and over again. So make sure you have the kind of priority targets you need to kill in order. And again, I would go in here as Archon. I think it's just going to make the fight easier from a target swapping perspective. I'm sure you'll see some good stuff with Void Weaver, but not my default here for this boss. Okay? All right, let's move on to the next one. All right, next up we have Sprocketmonger Lockenstock. This is more or less like the only like real single target boss that we have in the raid. There are no ads at all in this fight. You're purely just hitting one boss the entire time. And for the most part, you're pretty much staying within range, and you are moving around and handling different mechanics, but for the most part, the boss should always be in range. There's not really going to be a big problem here. So Void Weaver should absolutely be your default pick on this fight because, like we said a lot of times, it is like 4 or 5% ahead in terms of like pure single target damage compared to Archon. So definitely default to Void Weaver here. It's just a single target fight. There's really no like big optimization here other than like the normal bits of the fight. So using the conveyor belts to your advantage, knowing where to position for different mechanics, particularly in Mythic difficulty where the raid has colors assigned, similar to Mythic Silken Court from last season. There's a similar mechanic on Mythic here as well, although the positioning is a little bit more straightforward, I would say, and there is a bit of soaking involved. If you end up like soaking the traps, consider using like Fade, Desperate Prayer, but usually Mental Fortitude was enough for me when I was soaking, at least on PTR. And again, you're just kind of focusing the boss as much as you can, focus on your single target damage, and that's really it here. There's not a whole lot to really go over from like a shadow specific thing on this fight. The one note that I will mention just from like if you didn't know kind of a thing, there is a kind of mechanic, it's called Screw Up, where like drills spawn underneath your player. You can, on PTR at least, we're able to stack 2 of these at a time before actually moving. So similar to what we had with the tentacles on Bloodbound Horror last season, that kind of thing. You don't have to like move all over the place when they spawn. You can kind of wait for the first one to go out, spawn that second circle, and then move immediately after. If you don't get the timing right, I think you get silenced or like knocked up or whatever. So be very careful, just kind of pay attention, but you can kind of use that to conserve space a little bit more. But yeah, this boss is one of like the most like full tested bosses that we did, just because things were working pretty well here. And it's just the most patchwork that we got in this raid, so it should be pretty straightforward as Void Weaver for this boss. Okay, all right, let's move on to the One-Armed Bandit. All right, so for the One-Armed Bandit, this fight was kind of designed for Shadow Priest, so be ready to enjoy it for the most part here. The boss is going to be the main priority target throughout the entire encounter, and then ads will periodically spawn that need to be killed in a specific order. What I was doing for the most part here was just cleaving off the boss the entire fight. You want to make sure you keep the ads dotted when they do spawn, and then you let the raid kind of priority target the right ones down, and you're just peppering all of the ads because they do eventually all need to die within like a good consistent pace here. So for that reason, you kind of have your choice here if you want to play Archon versus Void Weaver. I think both should be quite viable here. The reason why Archon is kind of in this picture, even though it is that kind of loss that we're expecting compared to Void Weaver, is just with timings of like the way that your cooldowns end up working out. Void Weaver just has shorter windows, so there is going to be a couple awkward moments when you get into the fight where it's like, hey, wait a second, I should probably hold my Void Weaver cooldowns for like 5 or 10 seconds to make sure that I'm using them while the ads are all active. Archon can be a little bit more like loosey-goosey with things, and if you just full send all of your stuff on cooldown, eventually the ads will spawn like halfway through your Void form, and that's fine because by the time Void Form ends, the ads will be dead anyways, which is really important because you want to make sure to have all of your cooldowns for the last phase. He has a hard execute stop where once he hits a certain threshold where you've handled the ads enough times and gone through all the mechanics, he goes into his last execute phase, has a hard enrage timer, and needs to die there. So our whole goal is to get as many uses of our cooldowns to match up with the ads and have it ready for that final that final burn phase without any ads at the end. So I will say, I think being able to pull off Void Reaver on this fight will likely net you better damage, slightly better execute, generally speaking, but I think it might be easier for a lot of folks just to full send Archon on cooldown here. Personally, I'm going to walk into this fight trying out Void Reaver. I think it will just end up being better from like a really just massive Void Blast angle on the ads if you can get good timings here. Just will take a little bit more kind of knuckling down of what those timings actually are. So expect the Icy Veins guide to be updated with more exact timers. I don't have great ones for this boss right now. The logs seemed a little wonky with what I was testing and looking at different things. So hopefully things get a bit more consistent once it actually goes live, and I can tell you a little bit easier of like how to plan things. But if you decide you want to go into this as Void Weaver, pay attention to the ad timers. It might be a good idea to hold, a Void Torrent or a Dark Ascension or whatever full cooldown window if the ads are spawning in like 5 or 10 seconds, because you want to make sure for the duration of your windows, the ads are active as much as you can. And they're pretty much going to line up like every like 2-ish minutes is how it felt. Or when we get our big blast, and there'll be one kind of in the middle where you won't have a lot for. As Void Weaver, it's a little bit natural in the sense of like, that middle one you'll usually have a Void Torrent, but even that, it was a little dicey when I was looking at timers. So be a little careful here. You can still definitely make Archon work. I just think if you can figure out Void Weaver, it's going to be really strong here. Now, the other mechanic to mention is the coins that you'll see kind of happening throughout this. You do kind of want to periodically pay attention to where these guys are being thrown and where they're going to get thrown back by the raid members that click on them. If you stand just next to it, you get a 10% damage dealt increase here. So you definitely want to prioritize standing here. It's a little bit of a risk versus reward. If you get hit, you get stunned. So definitely be on the lookout. If you stand too far back from the boss, you'll miss that actual reticle with its trajectory there. I found it, obviously, like standing in the middle of the room is the most ideal thing. And there's that blue line. If you can kind of stand right next to it before it spawns, you can kind of just go on autopilot after that, instead of trying to like line yourself up with the coin after it's already been thrown. That is the other thing. You'll probably see me do it a couple times in footage. If the coin is coming from behind you forward, I found personally the best way to actually make sure I got the buff was to literally turn myself and position based on the coin and then go back to the boss. It's a little counterintuitive, but it helped me line it up better, at least as I was learning it, because it can be kind of hard to like base your character if it's coming from behind you forward and shimmy up next to it. It's just not what I'm used to dodging things. I would always overcorrect too much when I did that. So depending on your comfort level, that's going to be kind of the optimization of this fight more than anything, is getting big uptime on that and making sure you have your cooldowns for the end of the fight. Okay, so go into this, try whichever hero channel you want. I think both are going to be pretty good, but like I said, I think Void Weaver, if you can figure it out, will be solid. All right, rolling up to the second to last boss, it is Mugsy. So as a Shadow Priest, this boss was a little tough to give a whole lot of advice on just because we weren't able to see very far into it in testing. Although from what I can tell, I think this is a lot of similar to things you can expect with a lot of like general mechanic overlaps. I would walk into this fight as Void Weaver personally. I think there's not a whole lot of things where you're moving around too much, and I think Void Weaver is able to handle it pretty well, honestly. There is going to be a couple times where ads spawn out of the boss that need to be hit, but usually these were living long enough when we were testing to where if you had to focus them down, you could, and it would still be okay. If it ends up happening where you're just having to switch from ads to boss, add boss too often, then I would swap and play Archon instead. But I think defaulting to Void Weaver will be good here, especially on the kind of Earth side. So there's a bomb side and like an Earth ad side. The Earth ads are going to be a priority target, I think, depending on how much health that they have. Void Weaver felt really good in these windows because like you wouldn't always have enough for Void Eruption, and that would also feel weird because you're full cooldown on something that isn't the boss. But Void Weaver felt good because you could kind of Void Torrent. It was easy to like move around because you're like trying to stay stacked with your group. So I would try that for the most part here. But again, depending on how movement crazy it gets, you might find it easier to play Archon, just because of having access to Void Bolt during your cooldowns. So that will definitely be good. As a Void Weaver, though, if you do like kind of use your Death Speaker procs or Unfurling Darkness usage at good times, I think you'll still be able to handle the movement quite well here. And the kind of extra 5% single target you're going to get on this boss is just going to make it worth it. So I don't have too much else to say here. I have a lot of learning on this boss to do myself just to kind of see more of the overlaps. But that's kind of what I'm thinking going into Mugsy. All right, and the last boss is Gallywix himself. So I unfortunately did not get to test this boss because it was not tested on PTR. So I really don't have any footage to show you. I'll try to find something in the background that talks or gets to see him a little bit. But for the most part, there isn't really too much that I can say here. We just have to see the fight first. I would walk in being prepared to play Archon or Void Weaver on this fight. Reading through the dungeon journal, there is an absorb shield part of this fight, similar to what we had on like Fireack or Queen Ansarek. I don't think the actual amount of the absorb shield is going to be that significant, but if it turns out with tuning that phase is crucial, obviously Void Weaver having Devour Matter is going to be huge here. The fight does have adds. Again, we don't know the exact situation of like how stacked they are or like what the timings look like for Void Weaver versus Archon, but again, it's going to be probably a case of single target damage. It's going to be really important, so being able to play Void Weaver that does 5% more single target damage is likely going to be a good choice. So for me personally, obviously I'm going to be watching videos day one to see how this works, but when I go into this fight with my raid, we'll likely be trying out Void Weaver first. And then we'll likely have, like I said, the follow-up video in a couple weeks with more information on Gallywix. Just don't have enough to talk about quite yet. So, and that is all we have for this video. Hopefully this has kind of been helpful, giving you my thoughts going into the first week of the raid. If you didn't already catch it, I've said it a couple times, but the Icy Veins video, Icy Veins guide, I should say, has all of like my raid testing videos linked and all the specific tips of like when to use things like defensive abilities and cooldown timings and all that kind of stuff. I try to put as much good info into that as possible, so please check that out if you haven't already. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and we'll see you in the next video. Big thanks to everyone that supports me. Catch you next time.